Hello and welcome to week 2 of our sociology review. We've had a really busy week in sociology this week, so lots to recap. We started in year 9 looking at British culture and what Britain is and how this links to cages and all the other things that we've been covering so far. So we watched various videos, foreigners talking about stereotypical British behaviour, British characteristics and what it means to be British, and linking that to things like norms and values, deviance, etc., etc. We looked at the history of the British culture and the British Empire and how the two link together and the effect on the world. So things like globalisation coming here, culture, language, business, etc. We looked at achieved and described status, the difference between people who earn their status in society and people who are born into it, what that means in Britain, what it means elsewhere, and then diversity in Britain. So we've looked at some statistics about the British population, but what is Britain actually like in terms of the whole country and who lives there and how society functions. You can apply all of this to any topic in the GCSE, and obviously it's a great way of reminding yourself why we look at things in such a different way in sociology, and by putting people into groups as we have, how that can show us up differences and inequalities as well. Our next exercise was using this Venn diagram, taking class, age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality from our acronym CAGES, and deciding where we would put all of these different keywords. You can see those all in the top right hand corner. As people found, it was really difficult to put them into one single category quite often, and sometimes it was really difficult not to put them in all of the categories, and we had some excellent debates about what this meant and how a lot of them were dependent on those categories, such as class being something where your appearance can be different depending on the class you're in, and this might be altered as you age, this might be altered by what gender you are, what sexuality, what ethnicity, etc., etc. And it was the interaction between 2, 3, even all of these elements of CAGES, which you guys did really well at explaining and showing that actually sociology is very complex, and the more detail you add in, the more complex it gets. But the richer the debate was that we had, and I was very pleased with this. We then spent an hour on the difference between informal and formal social control. We looked at different agents of social control, the things which control us, and we discussed how informal and formal control are often linked together. Actually, the everyday nature of informal control influenced some of you more, you felt, but some of you said you were far more scared of a formal punishment, a formal sanction. And we looked at why that might be, and again we linked it to who we were and our different backgrounds and what that could mean. So a lot of you were very clear on the fact that the approval or disapproval of your friends was a massive influence on you. But some of you said that a formal sanction of some sort can affect you for the rest of your life. So it was very, very interesting to hear that. And we looked at all the different examples from family, friends, the law, the House of Lords, the police, etc., etc., the criminal justice system. Our big question which tied this all together this week was whether or not it was your parents that are the biggest influence on your life. We looked at the role of families and the idea of primary socialisation, how from your earliest age they teach you norms and values, rights and wrongs, expectations, how to fit into the family and how to fit into society. And obviously from there we developed that with examples such as secondary socialisation from education, from the media, from peers, etc., etc. This was really useful because obviously we can look at the functionalist perspective and the Marxist perspective and the feminist perspective when you get further into the GCSE. By the time you're in year 11 you should be able to link those quite nicely. A lot of people said as well that parents were their biggest influence, and then as we developed later sessions and we looked at other ideas, some people changed their minds and felt it was more their peers, which was very interesting as well. Our education section this week, we looked at the Marxist view of education. We looked at the studies by Paul Willis and the studies by Bowles and Gintis, and how the Marxist perspective is very negative towards education and shows that the class people are in is something which education reinforces. whereas functionalists would argue about social mobility and how education is a route out of poverty. Willis showed that anti-school subcultures from the lads very much reinforced class norms and class values. Bowles and Gintis talked more structurally about American high schools and how they're organised like work, and they train us to be passive and docile workers who just accept authority and go along with the rules, such as uniform, being on time, working hard, etc., etc. It's really interesting that the two Marxist views do clash almost in some ways, and Willis says that school is actually quite ineffective, whereas Bowles and Gintis seem to suggest that school is very, very effective in maintaining this hidden curriculum and these fixtures that force people into accepting their position in society. We then answered these 4 exam questions where we looked at how to answer 4-mark questions and fill those in. Here's the first 2 questions and some suggestions of how you could answer them to get full marks. Obviously the structure is important here. For the 4-mark question, point, explain, you're breaking down the method and a disadvantage, and then you're looking at what Willis did and why it was a disadvantage. You could have picked also interview here, but I thought the overt observation was the easiest one to criticise. Then curriculum is a straightforward point, evidence, explain paragraph. You could do this in a sentence or 2 and still attain 3 marks. So look for efficiency when you're answering these questions. Here are the second set of questions. So again, point, explain seemed the easiest way to answer these questions. Again, you're looking for a criticism of Durkheim. Why is it criticism? And what it shows us. Using explanation is the easiest way to pick up marks. Rather, dropping marks is often because students assume the examiner knows what they mean. One function of education according to Parsons. Again, you can pick any of the 4 functions, explain them, show why they're important. You can play around with these structures, you can play around with efficiency. Some of you may find it's quicker just to cram everything into 2 fairly complex sentences. Some of you might like to keep it very, very simple and rigid and write 4 short sentences, which really signpost the marks for you. In social stratification, we've been focusing on the Davis and Moore study. Obviously, look at the fact it's from 1945, so it's very old, and it's from the functionalist perspective. And essentially, we're looking at the idea that every society needs social stratification. You need people at the top, you need people at the bottom, people somewhere in between. And we've debated different structures previously, and we've looked at criticisms of Davis and Moore, and we've looked at why they might be right about some things and wrong about others, and picked apart our own views. Obviously, the easiest counter to this is Karl Marx, and we've discussed that previously. So Karl Marx with his proletariat bourgeoisie model, but again, Marx is writing from even earlier. So you may want to look at the following study by Davis and Moore and decide, because they're more up to date, as it were, or because they're newer, if they got a better handle on society and putting people into class brackets that maybe Marx doesn't have. Again, the criticisms of Davis and Moore is that there's perception around different jobs. Someone like nurses who don't get paid as much money but are seen as very important, compared to someone who maybe wins the lottery, who becomes very wealthy, but does their status then change because of that? And there's no proof that talent always wins out and vice versa. People at the bottom deserve to be there. So it's quite a controversial study in some ways, something that Marx would definitely argue against. We then moved on to this essay discussing social mobility and whether it's impossible or not. The essay is obviously worded to show that you can show both sides here, and Davis and Moore, being an obvious example, links to it really nicely, and Karl Marx has discussed the easy counter. By picking 2 sociological studies which are complete opposites is a good way to get into the higher bands. Wherever possible, I always recommend that. So functionalists and Marxists are really, really easy to pick, but for some essay questions it's going to be more appropriate to use feminists, for example, as a contrast, or even interactionists. But generally speaking, you're looking at opposites, and Davis and Moore would be very in favour of social mobility and talk about talent and meritocracy, And Karl Marx would obviously talk about the fixed nature of the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. The idea workers can never really progress, and bourgeoisie can never really lose their power and influence. You may remember the free class model structure that we looked at in the comedy sketch, and what it meant to be upper middle, lower class. And we've looked at different societies over time and how they're structured. So always refer back to social mobility over time and change over time. There are some keywords and some key ideas on the slide here which you can use whenever you want to talk about any of social stratification, but here is particularly pertinent to social mobility and whether or not people move up and down in society. Is it everyone? Is it some people? Is it most people? Is it easy? Is it difficult? What that might mean. And again, obviously think of cages, class, age, gender, ethnicity, even sexuality when it comes to social mobility, discrimination, etc., etc., how that can all play into it. I've been really proud of all of you who have been working really hard this week to improve your exam technique, to improve your understanding. And there's been a lot of key words this week which are really key across the whole of sociology. So if you look at this list, the norms and values are obviously very sort of day one sociology. We've looked at deviance, we've looked at meritocracy, we've looked at anti-school subcultures, gender stereotypes, achievement, the hidden curriculum, universal necessity of putting people into class, life chances. You can apply most of these across a range of the topics, but they do fit in to family, to education, crime and deviance, social stratification distinctly too. So go away and learn these words, look up what they mean if you're not sure, come up with examples, look at the pictures if you need to, think about these and start to use these in your lessons.